All right, so I'm still presenting, but don't worry, I'm going to hand off to Mike here in about a little over an hour. We're targeting, and this session is an introduction to decision problems. So the agenda for the second session is to go over basic elements of a decision problem, talk about decision rules, that would be involved in formalizing a decision problem. Talk about objectives that you want to, that are, the task of coming up with them and defining them in the context of a decision problem. We're going to talk about uncertainty. And then I'm going to close by talking about, in order to emphasize the importance of carefully thinking how to pose a decision problem for the purpose of quantitative analysis, as we would with in an adaptive management modeling exercise. I'm going to talk about a case from my own research that I'm still working on, featuring the common carp, which made an appearance on my title slide. And then I'm going to transition before the break is the plan over to Mike Springborn, who's, we decided it'd probably be a good idea to get a jump today relative to our original schedule on the particulars of Markov decision processes. So, and I want to make sure that I'm on the same page as Suzanne and Eric. So just to clarify, I'm going to be asking questions of the audience, and rather than the Q&A, which is a great feature for people watching the presentation to ask questions that may be answered by Iadine or Mike. I'll try to monitor to the extent I can. When I ask the audience a question, please put your response in the chat, and I'll open up the chat and pick a couple to highlight here. And in particular, I'm going to be asking, just to give you participants a heads up, you had homework. I am going to be asking you for volunteers to describe what you came up with just in passing for your homework, okay? So let me start by describing the approach to this first session, particularly for those who have seen material on structured decision problems and adaptive management and other courses. This first session may feel slow. That's okay. It's going to be a lot of review. And one of our goals in this review is to develop a baseline set of concepts and terminology that's going to be shared by all participants. So for the participants, you had some pre-tutorial readings that were also helpful for this purpose. But we're going to spend this session, in part working to bridge any jargon or framework divides between those of you who are economists, think of themselves as computer scientists, conservation scientists, and people coming from other backgrounds. So I'm going to talk very generally for a while here about structured decision problems. And our goal in working with a structured decision problem is to formalize a description of a decision problem in terms of essential components that may be measured in principle. And so what are these essential components? So a first one here is, first category rather, is actions. So these are decisions, levers, interventions. They take a variety of forms that a decision maker that is being thought of for this model may take. We have objectives. These are the aims of the decision maker that are trying to be achieved, maximized, minimized. And I should back up and say I'm going to talk about all of these categories in further depth as we keep going here in this first session. And then outcomes. And in the a lot of the literature that takes a broad qualitative view to start out with on structured decision problems, this outcome dimension has several components. We're going to include state variables. These are the quantities that are being tracked in the model that matter for the objective, that are influenced by actions. And as we'll get into through either in the breakouts or in case study examples throughout today, sometimes these state variables are discrete. They could be categories or classifications for, say, a threatened species. Is the species depleted? Is it just merely threatened? Or is it recovered or relatively abundant? Or it could be continuous, where we're trying to, we're interested in measuring, let's say, the most basic case for a lot of models of populations is biomass or abundance, not taking into account any sex or stage structure of the population. Although you certainly can in more more detailed models, as I'll touch on here a little bit later. And then in addition to the states, you need to describe transition rules, which captures how actions influence outcomes or future state variable values. And then to complete your description of the model, you need to describe also how actions may influence an objective, and then how states may influence your objective. So that's a preliminary view on this stuff, and we're going to unpack all of these categories as we continue. And then I'll stop here by saying that once you have just these three elements in place, it can be said, I think you have the essentials of a structured decision model. And the model encompasses all of these dimensions. So I've got a question for participants. Let's see how this goes. I'm a guinea pig and you're a guinea pig, you could say. So the question is, for participants, you were asked to come up with an example of a management problem for use in today's breakout session. Let's see if we can get 2 or 3 volunteers to list an action involved in their example problem. I'm going to see if I can see the chat. So I'm not seeing yet, we're seeing how this goes. I'm not yet seeing any participants volunteer in action. Okay, so Courtney provided lethal control of a problem species. Another invasive species example from Aaron Schwartz: burn or graze, burn prairie land or allow grazing, if I'm summarizing that right. Interestingly, Brian Crawford for a pine forest management problem talked about allowing different levels of burning as an action. I'll do one more. Thanks everybody for the examples rolling in. Matthew Clark offered up establishing a protected area, which is absolutely a great example of a discrete action. Maybe I'll connect that to another thing I'm going to bring up in a moment. That's common in actually a huge literature. I'm loving the examples coming in. Thank you. I think Suzanne even got in on the action. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm going to keep advancing though, and we'll have more opportunities for participants to share. So let me keep going. So let's talk about the action state relationship here a little bit further, building off of that. I think maybe you could call it a fundamental statement of a decision problem. So a lot of our energy is going to be spent on methods for arriving at a decision rule. And a decision rule is a strategy. I'm going to call it a strategy for selecting an action. And the nature of the decision rule will be influenced by the structure of the problem. And so, and it can be really interesting how that shakes out. So for example, there's a very large economic literature, and it comes up in other areas too, of optimal stopping problems, where you're trying to determine a stopping rule when you make a discrete and typically irreversible jump from one action to another. So just off the top of my head, I haven't done a paper on this or anything, but I'm sure there is one out there. You might think of a stopping rule as when to breach a dam that it's at the end of it, near the end of its life, to for any number of aims, to help fish populations recover. Maybe you're worried though about extra flooding. I don't know. This is in my region of the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. This is a big topic, and that's an example where you really have one choice. That you can't. It's hard to unbreach the dam, and you might as well assume it's irreversible. And it's all about just choosing the timing of when that happens. So some more jargon, and well, jargon's, a little more positive spin terminology that's useful for us to have under our belt. So another type of strategy is what's called open loop, and and I'm going to say I might mix this up. I might switch between, but another way of label for a strategy in this context is a policy. And I think policy may be somewhat more common in the technical literature. So one type of policy is an open loop rule where your action typically just depends on the time date of the, we're, essentially always thinking about a dynamic decision problem. I should emphasize the time date of the process, this year, next year, and so on. Importantly, it doesn't depend on the state variables in a way that I'm going to talk about coming up next. And this tutorial, some of you may have seen uh, open loop rules described in other courses you've taken. I think myself, others participating have worked on optimal control models, where typically you're trying to find a open loop strategy. Maybe some of you have heard of that. Our focus in this tutorial is not going to be primarily on open loop rules. However, they can be useful. They're getting more attention, and from my perspective, in some very advanced problems. But I just want to throw this out here to differentiate open loop from feedback or closed loop decision rules that, in contrast, do depend on the state variables. So what we're trying to determine is a feedback rule that gives the action that you choose as a function of the current state of the system. And this, as I talk about in a second, is a dynamic process where actions change the state evolves, and then in turn recommends a new action. A couple of points of emphasis here before I continue. This will be either obvious or intuitive for many of you, but I think it's worth emphasizing before I move on. So the first is that typically, with some exceptions, an action that's best, and a lot of today is going to be digging into what do we mean by best, but an action that is best in one state may not be a very good choice in another state. So if I have two state values, state prime, state double prime, double prime, these two, the action recommended is not necessarily going to be the same, although there are cases where this is true. And in planning this tutorial, what came up is that a lot of us, or some of us that have had experience trying to explain that basic feature of structured decision problems to people who don't have a background or non-experts, that can be actually surprising to them and somewhat challenging to explain. Another point I want to emphasize that I'd already touched on a bit is that while a feedback policy or rule is often going to be obtained as a static mathematical object, it's a function of the states. There are, and this gets a little technical at this point, but there are cases where the action is indexed by time as well. So you have like a little t subscript right here. Often it's not, and you just have a single optimal policy that you're determining when you work on models like this. So even though that's a static object, in application, it's fundamentally dynamic. So even though the policy you come up with is fixed, because the state variable is changing, the actual decision that's recommended is also a dynamic phenomenon. So I have another question just to mix it up here. Let's see how this goes. So and I'm gonna rely on the chat again. See if I can get some feedback here. Assume you're working to develop a structured decision model with non-experts, and you need to provide intuition for why a feedback policy might recommend a particular action for one state, but not another. And you're trying to get that idea across to people that have very little contact with these models or methods. How would you make a pitch for explaining that? I think this is harder than it sounds. Maybe I'm wrong, but can I get some feedback in the chat? Okay, so Christine, I think this is a good one. So she says, if you have a large patch of an invasive plant, you may want to manage aggressively then. But if the density of that invasive plant is smaller, it's too expensive, at least in that period. That's a really great intuitive example that I think it'd be easy for people to understand. Anybody else think of another one before we move on? All right, so Matt is offering one. I'm maybe from personal experience. I'm not a marathon runner at all, so I wouldn't know. But uh, the basic idea here is that your pace depends on how you feel. And I have seen Olympic runners, they really modulate their pace depending on where they are at in the race, or maybe where their competition is. I really like that example. There are other great examples rolling in. I like that example because uh, most of us, not me as much as I'd like, but most of us can relate to running and exercise. And I like that everyday example and that intuition there. That's great. I'm going to move on. So I'm known to do this. Did I duplicate a slide accidentally in a way that's not helpful for the flow of the presentation? I think I did, so I'll move on. So let's get into specifying the objective. And there are a variety of ways to do this. And this is where I'm going to spend maybe an inordinate amount of time on differentiating between the way that economists have sometimes approached this, and then the way that people from other disciplines have approached this issue. So the objective is essential and really drives the nature of any development that is done with a structured decision problem. It really shapes what the best action may be. And economists tend to do this as follows, and there's a lot of variation, but the basic story is we tend to try to measure the present value of rewards. And so this is not just an economic exercise. What I'm focusing on for to get started here is the notion of a reward that is maybe time dated and in general depends on the current value of the state variables and the current action. So the notion of a reward is quite general and applies to other cases I'm going to talk about here in a moment. But typically in economic studies, this takes the form of the present value of a sequence of rewards for the full time horizon of the decision problem. In other words, how many decision periods are we interested in tracking? And the way that discounting I'll get at more detail on discounting here. I'm going to try to get a little more organized and focus on a few things first. Forgive me. So what I'm talking about with present value and what I got started and I will finish is an example of a fundamental objective. I think most economists would say this is exactly what, in principle, we're trying to maximize or minimize in some context. You may wish to minimize economic harms, for example. Means objectives, I think in general, are indirect measures that are only are only valuable in so much as we think that they're contributing to a fundamental objective. So, and someone, one of the instructors can cut in if they don't quite agree, because this fundamental versus means distinction is not coming out of economics. So I'm doing my best, but I think one example might be conserving the greatest amount of undeveloped land at least cost, let's say. So that's just a means to an end in that it's only important if you think that conserved undeveloped land is maybe contributing to the persistence of a threatened species. So that's how I would describe that relationship between means and fundamental there. So back to this economic definition, or I think primarily economic concept of a present value calculation. So economists put a lot of effort into measuring rewards, so benefits and costs in apples to apples currency. Often it's directly, and a lot of work goes into doing that directly as willingness to pay. So money metric measures of the benefits or the public's willingness to pay, let's say, for conserving a threatened species, at least getting a lower bound on that. And then to complete this present value calculation, it's not enough just to measure these rewards, but you also need to have information about time preferences. And that's what I got started talking about with these beta terms. So these are discount factors. Hopefully people can see my mouse hovering, that are going to be less than 1. And the idea here is that all else being equal, you would prefer, most of us would prefer $1 today versus $1 10 years from now, right? And you can translate that principle to benefits of conservation, costs of different actions. And as time moves forward, you weight, because this beta is less than 1, squaring it is even smaller, an even smaller multiplier here, and you weight rewards progressively less in the future. Sometimes this weighting is modest. Other time, in some context, it may be a significant driver of what goes on in the problem. So I'm not just going to talk about economics all the time here, although I think it's important to have, for those of you who hadn't seen discounting, it's important to have that background. So I talked a minute ago about how economists try to arrive at these economic welfare measures and then compute their present value as the objective for structured decision-making problems. That's an example we would typically, I think, argue of a fundamental objective using the more interdisciplinary language. It's more common, my understanding is, and in conservation science, but there are also economic applications that do the same thing for non-present value type objectives. So one common one is what we're interested in optimizing is the probability that a species persists at some future time date above a critical threshold. And the future time date is summed up by this capital T. I mentioned variation on this in passing, but often this is done in a quite sophisticated way, taking into account some economic information by saying, not only our objective is to not only do this, but or some other conservation objective, but we want to minimize costs while reaching that objective. So it's flipped in that what you're minimizing is costs, and it's subject to a constraint that you reach some, let's say, minimum population, minimum probability of persistence, or a minimum area of land conserved. You're hitting a conservation target if it's feasible, but you want to minimize costs along the way. And often those costs are measured using present value calculations. So some of you might be thinking either be based on your experience beforehand or just in the course of this presentation, well, in problems I'm interested in, we care about a few things, or maybe not just one species, but several. And that's a case where, at least to start out with, your structured decision problem, you may write down a few objectives. So, we want, in this case, 3 species to survive. And it's challenging in those cases to compare those probabilities directly. Economists try it with measures of willingness to pay. Other researchers maybe assume some kind of weighting of these objectives and explore through sensitivity analysis. Our analysis of the structured decision problem, how does it turn out when we place the most weight, let's say, on species number 3? Iadine and others potentially participating have really exciting research that looks at multi-objective methods for working on MDPs and other similar models where a more sophisticated approach is taken. And I'll leave it to her if she has time to bring up that work in later days. But I just did want to put out there that there is research activity around working on structured decision problems without forming at least a simple weighted sum of your different objectives. All right. So maybe I'm going to throw it out again, take a pause, and those participants who had homework, maybe some who haven't had a chance to contribute yet, you were asked to come up with objectives in your management problem. Can I get some volunteers to talk about what they came up with?
Maybe while you're waiting for the responses, you can answer this question that came up. Is the use of Heaviside functions common in this literature?
I haven't encountered those directly myself a lot. Iadine, Mike, Paul, any, maybe I'm missing a connection there.
Suzanne, can you repeat the question? Is the use of? I can't see the question in the chat.
It's talking about the use of Heaviside functions, and I would say they're not terribly common, although you occasionally will see them.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, a Heaviside function, I guess I should qualify that, because by Heaviside function, I assume you mean something that is 0 for some values and 1 for other values. And yes, you will sometimes see such functions. And in fact, we will see examples where optimal actions might have that characteristic.
I'm going to pivot to the chat. I guess I could say that, maybe an objective could be specified where, the reward is 0 if, or some baseline value if a species is above a threshold, but then 0 if it falls below it in a simple conservation context. I guess you could see an objective like that.
Yeah, so it's actually in conservation and in invasive species management, often it's used to actually, as you said, evaluate either the probability of extinction of a species over time or the probability that a patch get infested. So it's if you specify your reward function, it's a bit early to talk about it, but if you use the 0 and 1 function, then you have your all optimization as a meaning that is appealing to managers. So that's convenient in that case. So it could be a probability of extinction or a probability of an area getting invaded.
Thanks, everyone. Great question from Herbert. All right, so I had a couple people. So Jody, I hope it's okay if I use first names, everybody. You can call me by my first name. Maximize a sustainable harvest of deer. So that could, that could have a number of refinements, but I think we get the basic idea. You want the most yield of deer harvest over time. That's a great one. And then here's Brian's saying that he's interested in his problem focuses on maximizing the number of persisting metapopulations of a threatened frog while minimizing costs. I think that one I also like because it connects some of the interesting questions of issues in specifying an objective. You have costs on the one side that all else being equal, you'd like less of, and more frog populations surviving, and putting that into a model, and it is and the objective is can be subtle and really interesting and important exercise. So I want to in passing here offer up an example of a problem I pulled from the classical, what's called bioeconomic literature, just to talk about how these components of a decision problem can be teased out of reading a journal article. So this is a older paper by two prominent researchers in bioeconomics, Huffaker and Jim Weiland. And it's the problem, or the title of the article is Animal Stocking Under Conditions of Declining Forage Nutrients. So what they were, the most basic version of their model had the following components. Their objective was they took the position of a cattle operation, and the objective was the present value of net revenue from raising and selling cattle. And the actions were, there's just one, and it was the density of cattle stocked on pasture land, so grazing on forage. Now, what makes this interesting for them is the connection. It's this outcome chain where cattle reduce forage, and the state variable, in fact, is not cattle density, which I think is kind of interesting way of posing a particularly simple form of this problem. The cattle, what might seem like a state variable to many of us, is actually what they adopt as the control, what you're influencing. And the state variable in this model is forage density. So cattle reduce forage, and both the state and actions feed into the objective. So forage density increases the net revenue from cattle. That's a sense that if you have forage doing the work that feeding operations might do, that reduces essentially your costs and makes your production more valuable. But the problem here, and the source of tension and interesting trade-offs to analyze, is that your cattle reduce that forage. And then, of course, your action, if you of this pasture stocking rate, increases, you increase your net revenue if you add cattle, but that's only true, interestingly, if forage density is high enough. Too much cattle mows down the forage, and you lose, all else being equal, revenue from your cattle operation. So this I'm looking at Suzanne, who's on the call, because this uses optimal control theory, with which she is preeminent expert in applying that to problems just like this. And this is an example of a deterministic dynamic economic model with continuous state variables and action variables. So notice how, as might be the case in other contexts, I haven't divided the action or state variable into discrete categories. So what I got out of this is, the reason I drew it out is, yeah, I liked drawing the connection between more, I think, modern and interdisciplinary adaptive management and structured decision-making terms and ways of formalizing a problem, and an older but still incredibly cool, I think, classical bioeconomic model. So I'm gonna offer a few asides. When you get asked to make slides and speak in a tutorial, you get to editorialize a little bit. So I'm gonna do that. Hope that's okay, everybody. So the main emphasis of this tutorial is on decision models for problems involving uncertainty. And I'm here, we're all here because we have a sense that that is important for making good models, and taking it into account leads to good decisions. But if you go back to, I'll put it up one more time, this diagram. Nowhere in here maybe we could all imagine relationships involving uncertainty, but nowhere in here have I included any source of uncertainty. And you might think that for a system like this example, sure, there are sources of uncertainty like the weather, droughts, disease, that are important. But you might think a lot of the relationships are fairly predictable. And there's a point I want to make, which is for many applications, you can get a lot of insight out of models that are deterministic. And so many of the tools in their simplest forms that we're going to review during this tutorial can be applied to models that are deterministic, and before we bring in any uncertainty. And I would claim that that's often a great way to start analyzing your problem, both for methodological and also conceptual reasons. It's just good practice, in my view, to begin at least some problems thinking about it that way. In other words, not every good, even or useful or fit for purpose, you could say, dynamic economic model has any uncertainty in it at all. But it is true that we think that many do, and methods for those problems are important, hence the focus of this tutorial. I just want to get that out there, though. So there's another aside I want to make or spend some time on, and this is, I think, trying to do more bridging of disciplinary divides and explain, many of you are economists. You may fall into a crowd with economists, for better or worse. And so I think this is useful to think about in this context. And that is that a lot of economic models, but also models in other disciplines for sure, particularly when we think about problems where managing people is as much of a challenge, or is as essential for understanding how the whole system may evolve, is as important as managing, say, natural populations, for example. And when that's the case, you often, either in the literature, run into papers, or maybe you yourself will be interested in working on models with multiple decision makers. And so here I've tried to do my best to elaborate on that basic structured decision problem framework, this time indexing actions and state variables and objectives by I. I here is a particular decision maker. So some people brought up, let's see, invasive species management. That's definitely a context where there may be multiple decision makers, and understanding their choices is important for predicting the dynamics of the system. Say multiple landowners for a lot of pests or invasive species, understanding what private landowners are doing with the invasion on their land is quite important, or maybe different state and local, or regional and local governments, for example. So in models like that, you may have states that describe attributes of other human or organizational decision makers. And I'm going to hover over it with my mouse. Hope everybody can see that. And similarly, you want to try to account for in your structured decision model potentially the influence of their actions, both on states that belong to them, the other decision makers that contribute maybe, notice, so I'm using -I here to indicate a state describing others, not decision maker I. And that contributes to the objective, even though those states belong to a different decision maker, the objective of the one for whom you're formulating this particular version of decision model. Similarly, those actions of those other decision makers may influence the state belonging to the primary, I guess you could call it, decision makers. So focusing on invasive species and land management, you may want to suppress a creature or invasive plant on your land, but how that turns out for you depends on what other people are doing. If so, maybe some people in this is very disconcerting for Americans and Pacific Northwesterners on the audience. Maybe some people saw the news about the murder hornet in Washington State. So that's an example where the state of Oregon, where I am, may be very concerned about actions being taken by the state of Washington to control this potentially very catastrophic invasive insect. I'll continue on by just saying, if you run into, in your exploration of this literature, dynamic games, or you've heard of game theory and you're wondering how does that connect with what we're doing? Well, game theoretic ideas and concepts can be and have been built into adaptive management models, and it increases the complexity as you might expect. This tutorial is not primarily focused on models with multiple decision makers. They do come up a lot in economics, which is why I wanted to draw the connection. But I will say that methods you use that you're going to learn about in this tutorial are the same methods with extension and variation that you would apply to analyze models with multiple decision makers. And if anybody has questions about this dimension and wants to learn more, I think those of us who are instructors can connect you with the resources. All right. So let's get into uncertainty, which is going to be a major focus of the tutorial content. And this is a subject that we can delve into even at this qualitative, from this qualitative perspective that I've been using so far. So I would argue that even though I've said that, I said in passing that it's not always necessary to start out your analysis of a decision problem with uncertainty baked in and really an emphasis of what you're doing. To even know whether you can, I think, safely or get a lot of traction out of setting it aside and to continue certainly into any adaptive management application, it's important to break out and consider carefully sources of uncertainty and how they impact a decision problem. So usually the easiest form of uncertainty, despite its huge breadth, to talk about when we get into this stuff is what's usually called process error. So in economics, usually it's much more it's more common to see the label stochasticity applied. And so here, just going back to our very basic graphical framework, you may have a decision rule that at its most basic, you just have two actions, do more or do less, or do something versus do nothing. And you think, your model of outcomes for your application says, well, if I do something, that's going to lead to something good state. If I do nothing, a less good or a bad state will arise, right? And we can think of lots of examples that have that basic structure. So process error refers to one classic source is environmental uncertainty, where I may push the state to a good outcome, but exogenous influences, I talked about weather in the cattle stocking example, that could have been a source of process uncertainty built into that older deterministic model. I may, in expectation, my action may lead to the good state, but I may end up, down here just because of bad luck. Meanwhile, it's an expectation doing nothing may lead to a bad outcome, but I could have good luck, good weather, despite letting forage for my cattle be kind of in what I would predict a bad place, and I don't do as bad as I thought I would. A related source of uncertainty is partial controllability. Sometimes this is referred to as implementation error. And the idea there is that the source of uncertainty is not an exogenous forcer like weather, let's say, but it could be lack of, in maybe a fishery management context, it could be that there's a noisy relationship between a harvest limit you set and an actual harvest that occurs for a variety of reasons, potentially owing to, by the time the order to stop fishing comes out, a lot of gear is already in the water, or there could be cheating or incomplete enforcement. And so what you lay down as your rule in that context may not map one-to-one in a deterministic sense to the influence on the state variable. Economists think a lot about sources of process error that don't have anything to do with environmental uncertainty or aren't linked directly to environmental uncertainty or even partial controllability. Often these sources of uncertainty appear in the objective function. So returning to the fishery management context, a fishery manager may be broadly concerned with economic performance of the fleet, and on a world market for landings of a particular species like shrimp in the United States, just drawing an example, that price may be noisy from year to year in that you can't predict it with certainty ahead of time. And that can influence the shape of your policy. That uncertainty that's not arising in the outcomes of the state variables directly are physical state variables like the population of shrimp, but instead arise from other economic factors, for example. I think that's the essential nature of stochasticity in this context, is that you have a system, unlike the hypothetical cattle management one I posed, where the dynamics, I'm hearing a little feedback. Did somebody unmute? Could I get everybody to mute? Yeah. it's better now. You know, the essential fact when you have stochasticity is that the future state of the system, conditional on the action you choose, is not perfectly predictable. So that's one form of uncertainty. But what makes the adaptive management literature so rich is that the goal is to account for other types of uncertainty that are equally as important in many contexts, and raise the possibility of learning, which is fundamental to the pursuit of an adaptive management model. So let's get into these other sources of uncertainty that are distinct, related but distinct from process error. So one that's easy to explain and is fun, and when you think about it, I would claim is ubiquitous, is observation error. So this describes the idea that you know, we don't observe the state of the system perfectly, or it could be you could be posing a structured decision model for a system where observations cost money to obtain or are difficult to obtain. There are all kinds of threatened populations, for example, that are quite difficult and expensive to measure. So not only may an observation be noisy, but you may not even have an observation to use for decision making unless you make an investment. And so, in other words, you don't have access to, you can't perfectly see how the outcome of your action turn up in the state variable. Instead, at best, you have an observation to work with that may contain error. Some jargon for this source of uncertainty is state uncertainty. I've used that in some of my work. Measurement error, that's usually the easiest way to convey it to a broad audience. Or partial observability is a technical term that comes up a lot in some of our tutorial content as well. So there are still further types of uncertainty that we want to consider here, and let's get into it. So another class, I should probably say, of forms of uncertainty come when the decision maker is uncertain about the model itself. So what I didn't say explicitly, but I think is kind of remarkable when whenever I reflect on it, is that up to now, every example I've discussed, including that classic bioeconomics paper, and all of the structure assumes implicitly that the decision maker knows the model perfectly. In other words, the links between state variables and actions and states and objectives, the source and nature of process error that hits the model. You can't predict the future with certainty, but you know the model that you'll use to predict that future. But I think most of us that do research start out with problems where once you form your structured decision problem, it's anything but known with certainty. There can be quite a bit of uncertainty about different functional responses or other relationships in the model. And so type of uncertainty that's called also known as in different literatures, different applications, parameter uncertainty, model uncertainty, structural uncertainty, refers to the following case where a decision maker maintains hypotheses about, let's say, a functional response. So, and this is really another way of putting this is alternative models. So I don't know the probability that doing something will lead to improvement or no improvement. I don't know in other words, the model that links my action to outcomes. And this is a key source of uncertainty for the purpose of adaptive management models, and it's a focus of a lot of our work. I want to say that observation uncertainty that I talked about a moment ago is also quite important. I also want to back up and say that, and I think Mike is going to talk about this a little bit more, but you can also have, I'm going to get into learning here, or just tee up the notion of learning and structured decision models. You know, a lot of our effort's going to be about decision models in which there's the possibility of learning through various means about an uncertain model, and maybe eventually identifying the most likely one through observation. But I want to back up and say that there's also learning in a limited sense in even models with stochasticity, and just in the following sense. You don't know and cannot predict perfectly the future, but when you step forward in time, usually the way these models are specified is you observe that uncertain outcome. So you learn, in other words, what's happened. This is different, and I want to distinguish the two in that typically in models with parameter uncertainty or model uncertainty, you introduce a different object here, a different type of state variable, which measures beliefs about an uncertain aspect of the decision problem. So you can maintain a belief about which model that you're trying to distinguish with in this hypothesis box is most likely. Maybe you start out thinking they're equally likely, and over time, through observation, through observing improvement versus no improvement with different actions, you refine your beliefs. And we'll get into a lot more detail in future sessions about what we might mean by this, what goes in here. And I'll step forward and describe that, and use the slide I prepared to just signal that the way that this new belief state variable pictured here evolves is based on observing actions and outcomes and learning if you can. How beliefs are assumed to change over time will depend on the structure of the problem, of course, and include what information is received following an action. So not every, it's important to say that not every problem in which you may have uncertain model components that you're trying to learn about will lend itself to learning, but many do, and that's the rationale for posing adaptive management models, and it's going to be expanded on a great deal in future work. But I wanted to circle around and emphasize one thing, is that unlike stepping forward through time and observing the outcome of a stochastic event, like did it rain or did it not rain, that type of uncertainty can be resolved just with one time step in a model where we don't have observation error complicating things. Here, learning through one time step is typically not possible, and that's kind of what makes these models interesting, is learning from actions and outcomes when it's possible is itself a dynamic process. All right, so I'm going to draw on an example just to contextualize some of what I've talked about from a paper by a fantastic researcher, Iadine Chadés, who worked on recovery and conservation of two interacting endangered species not far from where I live in Oregon here. But this was in, you can just not give me a thumbs up, this is in Washington, right? If I'm remembering correctly.
This was in British Columbia.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
Also, you might want to stop. There's a question that might be helpful to get answered. Okay. So let's do that first, if you're okay with this. And this is a person that is wanting to know the idea of when you have an arrow that goes straight from the action to the objective, they didn't quite understand what that meant. So you don't have to go way back there, but when you think about your diagram, basically the arrow from the action, basically there was an arrow going from the action to the objective, and they wanted to understand that.
Great question. And, these are kind of clarifying questions we really invite. So this is meant to capture how actions themselves directly influence the objective. And I tried to touch on this with limited success, I guess, when I was talking about the economic sense in which these objectives are posed. So in that per time step reward, it's very common to see the action included in that reward function. And some of the examples brought up by in the audience response really honed in on this. So one example was talking about conserving frog metapopulations while minimizing costs. Well, the conservation actions that help the frog populations would show up in typically the same time step, but maybe not. There can be some nuance there as going directly into the objective, the component of the objective, like costs in a particular year directly. And so that's why we draw an arrow from actions to objectives, because the impact of your actions on the performance of your strategy may depend not just on how the action influences the state, but also how the action influences the objective. And I think, Paul, were you going to weigh in?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we understand the distinction between the objective and the value the objective takes on. So we could talk about changing our actual objective functions, and that's usually done in what's called double loop learning, where we may revisit a problem maybe after 5 or 10 years and decide that what we had done wasn't really correct. But I think in the context of the modeling that we're doing here, we have a fixed objective function, but that objective function is a function of both states and actions. So the values of the objective are influenced by the states and the actions, whereas the function itself may not be.
It's an excellent point. That's a great clarifying point. I'm not seeing that question in the Q&A.
That person put the question in the chat.
No worries.
That's
and I think that hopefully that answered it. And if you are, I can't see immediately. I can't see immediately if you're going to be in the breakouts. If you're not, you can just email me directly. I'll make sure my email is easy to find. If you have any follow-up questions, happy to answer them. Okay, so let's keep going. This is by necessity qualitative. It's setting the table. Before I continue with Iadine's example, and really making these ideas fixed with actual models that you're going to work on solving is one major objective of the tutorial. So more to come if it's as fuzzy as this cloud I drew up there for now, at least. All right, so I like this paper despite not automatically remembering an important detail about the case study, because it comes up a lot. The basic challenge in conservation work, where a lot of, in my view, management failures have arisen from prioritizing just one species, not thinking about impacts on another. And so the setting here is that you had two endangered species, sea otters and northern abalone, and sea otters predate on or prey on the abalone. Actions involve anti-abalone poaching measures. You can introduce or cull sea otters in this case, or do nothing. State variables in this paper, which, and by the way, I have references to it at the end, are the abundance of sea otters and the density of abalone. And what I liked about what Iadine did here is that this is an example. This is going back a little ways to the very common context where you have multiple objectives. You know, how do you compare the persistence of abalone and the persistence of sea otters? What she did is she constructed, she and her co-authors constructed a weighted minimum of sea otter and abalone states. So not just the, you know, the performance is equal to the lesser of the two state abundances, but she explored weightings to see how if we put a little bit more weight on abalone versus sea otters, what does that do to the solution? And this is, you know, this work in fact tees up work she's doing more recently with some of her co-authors on taking a more sophisticated approach to breaking out those different objectives. And I'm not going to do a full review of the paper. I encourage you to check it out. Certainly during or after the tutorial, you might actually get, you might glance at it now and get even more out of it later. But this is to fix some of our earlier concepts. Both of the state variables in her model were continuous. So instead of categories for like status of, say, abalone, you know, very bad, less bad, or good, she was modeling continuous responses, and that is also a feature that I personally liked about this paper. So, and it's also a great exercise. I got a lot out of going back to papers and dividing up aspects or components of them into this basic framework here. So I'm going to spend. I think I'm doing okay for time, and Mike will click his video on and give me the signal if I'm not, I trust. But I did want to make another aside, a personal perspective on empirical work and structured decision models. So many of you in the tutorial, in the audience, I would imagine are primarily empirical researchers, empirical people. It's as I said, it's certainly the dominant vibe in my area of economics. And one area I'm really interested in, which I would actually invite people at this tutorial to go out and work on, because I think there's a ton of opportunity here, is the closer integration of careful empirical work with adaptive management models. So I'll just line that up by saying that you need a good practical empirical work, and that's really where I see the research opportunity is you know, closer integration and relationship between models, empirical models that you can estimate, and decision problems that use that estimates. And I think to do really high quality work, and the co-instructors here, I think all have really nice examples of this. It does require data, and it's maybe no surprise that the better data that goes in, typically you get better input coming out. However, I would also say that for useful decision models, the empirical burden is typically less than what certainly is usually called for in very high quality economic identification exercises. When I say identification, what I mean by that is economic research that attempts to draw causal or make causal inferences using observational data, typically through a variety of really clever means. And I would argue that you know, often you get better results when you have better data, but it's actually very context dependent. And that's where I see a lot of room for collaboration between empiricists and experts or practitioners of adaptive management is to really think about when might more data really help you make a better decision. And actually that basic question, the value of information, is going to be one of the emphases of the work on adaptive management models that we're going to get into. So just another plug for if you're coming from an empirical perspective, lots of opportunities to do both if you want to get into this area. So I think I only have one more point at which I'm going to bug participants here. So I'm going to throw it to the Q&A, or excuse me, the chat one more time. Those of you who had homework, when you were doing your homework, if you thought about measurement, like what would I need to measure or quantify to work on this, this problem, what came up? What did you think about, if anything? Like data, you could summarize this as data needs. Can I get any responses in the chat? I have a backup example if okay, so Courtney's helping me out. Nicholas is I think Nicholas is thinking about observational uncertainty, maybe indirectly, in that population size for his application could be challenging to measure. And that is a kind of points to an interesting divide that we'll learn more about between what would you need to measure to set up your model versus what is one way of saying this is endogenous to how your model works, where you're in some sense modeling the information that you expect to come in and make decisions using that information. So Suzanne has another exercise example. I love it. I want to learn more about her application. Iadine, if we'd been able to gather in Knoxville, I sense like some kind of fun run or something we could have done, which is too bad. Maybe some other time. So maybe those of you who didn't spend as much time on this dimension, which I think is interesting and useful to talk about for the breakouts, maybe think about that a little bit before we get into those. All right, I think I think the handoff to Mike is going to go roughly on schedule, which is nice, but I do have a little bit more time within the margin of error to talk about a case study where the point I'm going to try to make with this is I began the session with CARP, and it's going to end with CARP. And I want to make the point that the qualitative conceptual stuff that has been the theme of this session, it's anything but busy work for students or people learning about this stuff. It's in my view what I would want to sit down with as a practitioner to map out, and I'll talk about a application. So a project that's in process, no papers I can point to yet, is invasive common carp in a very sad case ultimately of Malheur Lake in Oregon. And the common carp was introduced to this shallow lake decades ago and has since flipped the system into a turbid, bad, stable state, which is very bad for what was once compared to the Everglades for Americans in my audience. Very, very verdant and important bird habitat. Someone dumped a few fish in there, and the rest is history. And there's been periodic efforts over time to get rid of the carp. I know that carp are also a problem in Australia. It's a very difficult and challenging invasive species when it is an invasive species. So this is this vast shallow lake in the eastern part of the US state of Oregon, and you can actually see the lack of green showing up here and a lot of turbid open water. And it's a very complex system where turbidity, which is bad, that's a mean, I think that would be an example of a means objective or a quantity relevant for a means objective. More turbidity, less plants, fewer birds is the essential chain there. And I was brought in on this at Oregon State to see what I could do with adding to models already under development. And so my colleague Brown and Walker, I think these are Australian researchers. Their model was extended and applied to Malheur Lake by researchers at Oregon State, which brought me in. And they've done a lot of very careful, very thoughtful simulation-based exploration of the essentially the chain between the actions, state variables, and outcomes without any of the stuff you're going to start learning about or reviewing today. Any optimization work, and with a particular perspective on what the goals are. So I think I brought up this case study because I have a feeling this happens to adaptive management practitioners all the time. So very smart researchers had a very cool simulation model with, among other features, 20 carp age classes and at least one environmental state, which is the lake area, which fluctuates. So the lake gets smaller, and that's worse for lake water quality. It gets bigger in certain years, which is better for lake quality. The problem is it's also better for carp reproduction, which is a particularly pernicious feature of it. So I was brought in and I'm like, okay, your problem has 21 at least state variables that you're modeling as being continuous. And so a phrase that you're going to hear more about, if you haven't already heard it, is the curse of dimensionality, which refers, I won't steal too much of what's coming up, but it refers to the challenge of working with structured decision models with lots of state variables. And it also had multiple controls or levers you could pull on the system. You could harvest adults. You can increase habitat for the birds, the avian fish predators that are still there. So you make it more welcoming for them. They will come and they will eat carp. And then you can also electrofish for eggs. And there are other interesting and challenging features of this density-dependent growth. Many of you will know what I'm talking about there. And the model for predicting lake area from year to year is also quite complex. So what did I do? This is still work in progress. I decided I decided not finish this slide. My bad. So you'll still see the otter. So ignore behind the curtain or in front of the curtain this otter statement here. I'll decrease. I'll describe what I meant there. I apologize. So basically, the approach is I'm going to approximate the solution with fewer state variables. So I focused just on one action to get started. And I want to draw a connection to the question that Paul answered. You can remove adult carp. This adult removal costs money and feeds directly into the objective. The per period reward for that period in which you choose to reduce carp. Unfortunately, I feel like if otters did live in this lake, they might help with the carp, but there are no otters. So really here, this is removing adult carp, decreases adult abundance. And what's interesting about the application I'm working on here is that, I'm not going to consider for now that any of the secondary levers of trying to go after juveniles or juvenile carp in particular. I kept 3 state variables: juvenile abundance, adult abundance, and lake area. And carp biomass, and so I'm tracking all 3 state variables in this model I'm working on. Carp biomass is bad for reasons I'll describe in a minute, and higher lake area is good, conditional on carp biomass. But of course, I talked about that difficult feedback between lake area and carp reproduction. So there's not a lot of primary economic research on the value of conservation in this system. So actually, my approach is really similar to what Iadine did in her 2012 paper. I essentially got started by weighting. I did have information on costs, and I essentially assumed a value of carp abundance, excuse me, the damage caused by carp abundance, or rather, another way of saying it is the cost. And I'll talk about how that connects to other aspects here in a minute. And my message here that I'm going to close with is that just a little bit, even as simplified and rudimentary as this model was, it still went a long way. In particular, the solution I came up with, I was able to show my collaborators, outperformed heuristic removal policies they'd come up with, which in a, I think, a really intelligent way, just based on lake area. So you remove carp when the lake area is low. It turns out that it's also cheaper and more effective to remove carp when the abundance is low. But what I found is that if you also calibrate your removal to what you know about abundance of carp, just add a little bit more information and do some fairly basic MDP optimization, as Mike is about to talk about, the policy I came up with on average outperformed their heuristic, including on measures that I wasn't even trying to optimize, which is just a density of carp. So it did better, as you might expect, because it incorporated more information. But I was able to serve as a bridge for my collaborators by doing that work with AM tools, essentially, that they weren't able to do on their own. So that's a qualitative introductory overview. That's all I have for this first session. I'm going to throw up some references here that I can make available to anybody who's interested. I've seen some activity in the chat. And next up, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Springborn to get a jump on his session on MDPs.